This is TWiT.
When I first got an opportunity to do the show, we talked about whiskey a bit, and often I found myself explaining bits about how whiskey was made to sort of understand why I selected this particular bottle. And that has now evolved into, 8 or 9 parts where we talk through the entire Scottish whiskey making process. And Mikah, you got to see the end of that last week. And so I asked on the Discord what we should do next, and folks asked for American Bourbon. So I'm not going to do a 9-part series on American Bourbon because it's not that different. I will focus on the differences. I mean, in the end, for some reason, humans like to take grains and ferment them, distill them to raise them to solvent levels, and then suck flavors out of wood and drink it. Mm-hmm. The American Bourbon, of course, starts back with America first being a set of colonies in the UK because it grew a lot of corn. And generally speaking, you only make alcohol when you have enough to eat. And so you have food you have grain left over to store, and before it goes bad, you distill it because it's a way to store it for longer, and it's kind of fun. But the modern American bourbon really starts in 1964 when Congress passes a law declaring bourbon whiskey a distinctive product of the United States. And the federal standards of identity of a distilled spirit, because there is such a thing, specified what an American bourbon was. And it was to be a grain mixture that was at least 51% corn, that would be distilled no higher than 80% alcohol, and then would be aged in new charred American oak barrels. The distillate being put into the barrel can be no higher than 62.5%. And we talked about this when we were talking about barreling on the Scottish whiskey side, that much higher than that, and you start to pull bad flavors out of the wood. So it makes sense that they came in that number, although the Scots use 63.5 because they're often using used bourbon barrels and they still want to pull some flavors from those. If it's spent 2 years, it has to be aged in barrels. It needs to be a minimum of 2 years. At 2 years, it can be called straight bourbon. Most bourbon is aged longer than that. If it's aged less than 4 years, you're required to put an age statement on it. In other words, the youngest thing in the barrel in the bottle has to be on the label. After 4 years, you're not required to do that. And so the fact that if you think about most bourbons, you've never seen an age statement on them, they're typically 5 to 6 years old. That's the normal range of aging in Kentucky conditions. It doesn't have to be made in Kentucky, but Kentucky has ideal conditions for it, which are different from Scotland. They have similar water in the sense that there's lots of limestone in Kentucky, which makes the water very soft. But Kentucky is quite a bit drier and quite a bit hotter in the summer and colder in the winters. You know, Scotland is a very humid, temperature consistent place. So its process of aging are different, which is why you rarely see very old aged bourbons. It's very difficult to keep the barrels in range. It's warm enough that they actually lose water and the alcohol level goes up. But that's mostly because its low humidity is so low. Other rules around bourbon whiskey, it has to be made in the U.S. to be called bourbon. No filtration steps at all. I'm looking at you, Jack Daniels. They're not allowed to be called bourbon because you do carbon filtration. Not that it's a bad thing, just those are the rules. Also, no caramel coloring and only water for dilution. So let's talk about how this is different from Scottish whiskey. The first and biggest thing is a mixture of grains, or what's known as the mash bill. So a mash bill is basically the recipe of what kind of grains are you going to use to make your whiskey. Because of the rules, it's going to be corn, first and foremost, at least half corn, typically 67, even as high as 80%. Almost all bourbons, and there are a few exceptions, will have a certain amount of malted barley in it, between 5 and 15%. And that's because it provides amylase, which helps to digest in the fermentation process, the compounds that will tend to make methanol, the stuff that makes you go blind. You want ethanol, as little methanol as possible. And then there'll be a flavor grain, a grain that'll sit in between those two, between the corn and the barley, often rye, sometimes wheat. So most of the bourbons you know of, like your Buffalo Traces, Bullets, and so forth, are what they call high rye bourbons. They have 10 to 20% of their content is rye. And then there's a few high wheat bourbons, not as many. I think the best known of them would be Maker's Mark. Maker's Mark is 70% corn, 14% barley, 16% red winter wheat. But also Blanton's, Weller, the famous Pappy Van Winkle, all high wheat bourbons. The other interesting step, because now you have a multiple grains, is how you treat the grains in preparation for fermentation. So we're used to malting barley, because malting barley really means germinating it, getting it ready to actually grow to be a plant, and then killing it before it can really live. So 2 or 3 days in water, typically a little bit of churning up until it turns a bit green. And that's actually converting a lot of those long chain carbohydrates into sugars, which we can then extract to make our initial stage of beer. But it doesn't work the same way for corn and for rye. They don't tend to make short chain sugars right off the bat. So there's a different extraction process, and it's called grain cooking. And essentially imagine a gigantic pressure cooker, although the pressures are relatively low. Different grains are cooked. Each grain is cooked separately. For production purposes, because we're usually using continuous column stills, we want to keep this process going all of the time. They keep the cooking time down to between 25 and 30 minutes, but they vary the temperature and the pressure depending on the grain. So corn goes at the hottest, about 220 degrees Fahrenheit is 114 Celsius, for about a half hour. They typically use a little extra pressure on corn because it's the hardest to extract from. It's a very robust grain. But that cooking process helps to break the hulls down a bit, start the sugar conversion process. Rye is a little bit cooler, 170 Fahrenheit, 77 degrees Celsius. And barley, which is already malted, is the lowest at 150 degrees, 66 degrees Celsius. So each of those grains are handled separately. They're done in water in these pressure cookers, and then they're combined into a mash barrel. Typically directly into fermentation, and then they're cooled down so they don't kill the yeast. Where in Scotland, yeasts are very consistent. There's basically been strict rules around which yeast to use. In America, the yeasts vary wildly. There also tend to be trade secrets. In the pre-prohibition days, and believe me, the stories about whiskey before and after prohibition are great. I think we'll end up doing a whole thing on that at some point if we want to keep talking about this stuff. Each of these distilleries have basically developed their own and maintained their own yeast. They have little yeast banks, they have growing facilities, and so on. And for some brands, different editions of their bourbon will actually use their different yeast strains. Normally, a fermenter are gigantic tanks. They're usually made of wood, sometimes oak, sometimes cypress. And they operate around 77 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 25 to 30 degrees Celsius. You'll note I'm using all the measurements of the oppressors first because we are talking American. They'll also add sour mash to the tank for fermentation. We'll talk more about sour mash as we go along, but it's basically the leftovers from previous distillations are put into it. You'll see the word sour mash on most bottles. It's a normal thing. There is such a thing as sweet mash. If we were going to make a bourbon without any of the stillage from previous distillations, that would be a sweet mash, but it's not commonly done. The goal is to ferment essentially a strong beer, a kind of what they call distiller's beer, 9 to 11% alcohol, depending on the particular distiller and the particular yeast. Ferments run about 3 to 4 days long. The fermentation process, of course, is warm, and you don't want things to get too hot. So those tanks can only be so big. If they get too hot, it'll kill the yeast. Anything about 104 degrees is going to start killing off yeast. In some cases, some distilleries will actually cool their fermenters. They run coils of stainless steel piping in the tanks to try and keep the temperature down. But there are limits. As that fermentation reaches the alcohol level they expect, they will drain it into a beer tank. These beer tanks tend to be bigger than the fermentation tanks because they are then going to feed it directly into a still, and it's a continuous process. So when the beer tanks, which are stainless steel, get down to about 1/3, there's enough room typically to make a full drop of a fermentation tank into it and keep the process running. And I give you a sense that there's an urgency here of continuous flow for most of these bourbon distilleries. The And that takes us to distillation. And the vast majority of bourbon distilleries use column stills. Now, a column still is basically a big metal tube, almost always stainless steel, and they're quite large, 15 to as high as 60 feet tall, and somewhere between 2 to 6 feet wide. They're big. I've seen a bunch of them. The larger they are, the higher their level of distillation. And so depending on the way you want to make your bourbon, you'll want a bigger column still or a smaller one. We've talked about column stills a bit in the Scottish series. Not that the column stills are rarely used in Scottish distillery. It's always pot stills, which are batch based. You load them, you run them, you clean them, you run them again, you do it again. In column stills, the beer is basically being dropped into the top of the still, and inside these columns are a series of plates, and the plates have holes in them. The holes have lips, so the beer has to build up a bit on each plate before it can drip down to the next one. But those holes also allow alcohol to evaporate out, and it's taken out the top of the column still. So beer goes in at the top and works its way down, and alcohol evaporates and heads back up. This whole process happens at relatively low temperatures. The bottom of the column will be the hottest. It's near boiling, somewhere between 200, 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And the top of the column is more like 170 to 185. The small stills typically will distill up to about 60% ABV. Remember, you're not allowed to go over 80%, so the biggest stills tune themselves to go to about 80%. If you go higher than that, you're not allowed to call yourself bourbon. Now you're getting ready to make vodka, essentially, right? Vodkas are often distilled to 93, 95%. So this is a continuous process. You're always able to feed beer into the bottom, into the top, alcohol coming out of the bottom. But you do build up stillage in the bottom. This is leftover bits of grain, or leftover bits of the ferment, proteins, fats, things like that, lots of water. And so that is drained off and shipped to stillage tanks where it will be prepped to be sour mash. In every case, after you come out of the stainless steel column still, you need to be exposed to copper. We talked about this in the Scottish stage as well, where you need to take certain bad flavor compounds out of the distillate, typically sulfurs, which come from the barley and from corn. And so if you're not actually using a pot still, and some distilleries do, you'll use a thing called a doubler. And a doubler is essentially a reflux flow. It's got a sort of dome shape to it. And as the alcohol evaporates up, it hits the walls and falls back down. And some of it will escape out the top. And in the process has this catalytic reaction that removes those poor flavors from the distillate. And then it can head over to into the condensers. So in the case of like a distillery like Maker's Mark, and we've talked about Maker's Mark before, they use a column still that raises it to about 60%. And I've had a chance to sample that 60% in its particular flavor. And he literally took it directly from the still as it was running. And I'm like, aren't you afraid of contamination? Oh, wait, it's pure alcohol. It's going to, what would you sterilize it with? And then running right beside it is the pot still, which raises it from 60% to about 73%. And it does it in a much slower batch process. So they have several of these pot stills, and we get to taste it again. And you saw this really remarkable flavor change, that the sort of oily bitterness that came out of the column still is removed by the pot still, that copper reactions as well as the reflux process. But either way, this all now ends up heading over to the condensers to be cooled. In the meantime, we have this side track where all that stillage is being shipped over to the stillage tanks. Now, this stillage is a bit sour, which really means it's acidic. Recognizing that a pH of 7 is completely neutral. Yeast doesn't actually like to be in a pH environment of 7. They'd rather be in a pH environment of 5.4 to 5.8. It likes a little acidity. It operates faster, generates carbon dioxide, converts to alcohol, and so forth. And so rather than spend money to lower the pH level in the fermentation tanks, you take this sour mash and you treat it, you get it to the right acidity level, and then you put it back into the fermentation tanks to sour the tanks. That is sour mash. It's only a little bit, somewhere between 5 and 10%, depending on the distillery. But it's a mechanism which they use the stillage and goes on. All of the rest of the leftovers are dried and turned into animal feed, and then either sold or given away. All right. We're coming out of condensers. We've cooled this liquid that's somewhere between 75 and 80% alcohol. And we turn it back. We get it back into a liquid. It's often tasted at this point, not at that jet fuel volume. They'll usually cut it with water, get down to about 20% and check its grain flavors and so forth. At this point, you really are just tasting the grain. There's no color to it. It's completely clear. And if you're happy with it at that point, sometimes there's sour notes and so forth that might ruin a batch, which does happen. You're ready for barreling. So the barreling process, this is the bourbon process, with one of the things that makes bourbon distinct. Always American white oak barrels. They are 53 U.S. gallons, which is what used to be called a Queen Anne gallon, but nobody talks about that anymore. That comes out to about 200 liters. There are local cooperages all over the different whiskey making areas, and they make the barrels out of this white oak. All oaks are toasted. So as the barrel is assembled, the staves are put into a base. The initial set of bands are put on and the bottom is put on. And before the upper part of the barrel is contracted to complete its shape and a top put on, they'll do 2 stages of firing. The first stage is called a toasting stage. So this is lower temperature for a longer time. And it actually causes wood sugars, turns the wood red. Quite a bit of color from it. It's almost like caramel. And then the second firing is with much higher heat, and they'll char the inside of the barrels. Every distillery and every brand has their own recipe for how barrels should be done. There's lots of variations in that. Sometimes the char is very strong, sometimes it's lighter. And then the barrel is finished assembly and it's shipped off to the distillery where they can begin their aging process. So barrels are loaded the traditional way. They're typically stored horizontally in rack rooms. Different distilleries have different styles of rack rooms. The most traditional one looks very much like a warehouse. It has multiple floors on it, sometimes even an elevator, and they lay the barrels horizontally in racks. Kentucky is, again, both hotter in the summertime, cooler in the wintertime, and low humidity. So aging is very challenging. Sometimes you lose alcohol, sometimes you lose water, depending on the conditions. And if you go above 80%, you can't sell it as bourbon. And if you go below 40%, you can't sell it as bourbon. So you're playing a game. Many distillers rotate barrels. In fact, in Maker's Mark was famous for having these, or they used to be more popular now, but Maker's Mark has this very famous racking system where they can take the bottom barrel out and have the other barrels slide down. And so every 6 months or so, depending on the season, you have a rotation of where the barrels are taking heat or being in more moderate environments and so forth. There are also some that actually cool, do air circulation or provide other temperature management for the barrel rooms to try and get those barrels to go longer. If you can, again, most bourbons you don't find very old. The typical age is 5 to 6 years. Where you find older bourbons, you'll find their barrel rooms are often made of stone, partially underground, all mechanisms to slow the aging process. You can spend more time in wood without altering the alcohol level near as much. Bottling process is basically the same. Once it's reached a point where they're happy with the aging, a master distiller pulls barrels for a given lot. They sample them, taste test them, then they'll use the same very similar combining techniques, add water to it to reduce it to its typical proof levels, which are 45 to 47%. Again, a good level for minimizing flocculation. You remember that?
I remember that word.
Not that the Americans do any chill filtration ever. So they do that primarily by keeping their alcohol level a bit higher. And that brings us to our whiskey of the week, which is Woodford Reserve. Woodford Reserve is very well priced, about $35 for a 750 ml bottle or 26 ounce bottle. The history of the site for Woodford Reserve has been many different distilleries over the years. Again, Prohibition had a huge impact on it. Its current owner is a company called Brown-Forman. They also owned Old Forester, Cooper's Craft, and Jack Daniels. The mash bill in their standard Woodford edition is 72% corn, 18% rye, 10% barley. They ferment in 7,500 gallon cypress fats. They run about a 5 to 7 day fermentation. They use very little sour mash, typically as low as 1%, 1 or 2% as all. And unlike virtually any other distillery in the U.S., they use only pot stills, and they triple pot still distill. So they have a 2,500 gallon beer still. That's the large one, which typically will raise your 9% beer up to 40%. Then they have a low wine still, which is about 1,650 gallons. That takes it to 55%. And then their high wine or spirit still, that raises it up to about 78%. Then they'll cut it with water to 55% and barrel it, typically for 5 to 6 years, in a water-cooled and water-heated rack house. So they take water out of the river all of the time, and if they need cooling, they pump that cold water through the pipes in their rack houses. And in the wintertime, when it gets awfully cold, they actually have a little boiler, and they'll heat water up and pump it through the rack houses to keep the temperature more stable. That's what makes Woodford distinct. It's a triple distilled rye mash. It's quite a mild, easy drinking kind of whiskey. One I recommend. I usually have on my shelf. If you like bourbon, you'll like this one. It hasn't got a lot of punch to it, but it's nicely made and reasonably priced.
Yeah, I've actually seen that in stores. Just right there on the shelf. Not hard to find.
Yeah, not a rare. I mean, there are incredibly rare bourbons. I have pursued a few unicorns over the years, like Parker's Family Select, which only makes a few hundred bottles of that edition any given year. If you want to go nuts on bourbon, you can. There are plenty of reasonably priced bourbons you can get that drink very nicely.
Yep.